Yeah.
All right. So the predetermined overhead rate, I like to use that as my abbreviation. For the total, we've included the fixed and we've included the variable. So we would take 1,064,000 divided by 140,000 direct labor hours. So dollars divided by direct labor hours would give us the rate per direct labor hour, correct? So let's see if I could do my math right. Did you get $76
Nope.
per direct labor hour? That's the way, can't just say 76. The predetermined overhead rate is $76 per direct labor hour. So every direct labor hour on that job that it took to do job 550, we multiply by the $76 predetermined overhead rate. So we computed the plant-wide predetermined overhead rate, compute the total manufacturing cost for job 550. That was, so this is part A of that problem, isn't it? Part B,
I
when
got
it says,
I got $7.60.
Cents.
Yeah.
okay, I thought that was wrong, but nobody said anything. Or somebody said 76, didn't they?
No.
Well, how did I put 76 down then? I just put it down?
Yep.
Okay, well, I'm
I think
glad.
you divided by 14,000 instead of 140.
Okay, maybe I forgot to put in a zero on the calculator. But you got to keep me honest here. All right, I appreciate it. In B, they're asking to compute the plant-wide predetermined. No, in B, compute the total manufacturing cost. There's three costs. You got direct material costs. You got direct labor costs. You use actual. You use actual for those two. Did they give us an actual amount? Oh, they did, didn't they?
Yeah.
They said job 550 started and completed, and the following's available. The direct materials are $175.
Can you move the paper up?
I
We
sure
can't see it.
can.
Thank you.
Yeah, the problem is there's a stand for the light here, or the camera. So direct labor, the actual cost, they tell us $225. And then the third cost, these two are at actual. But our manufacturing overhead, we have to use the applied amount. We have to apply it, and that's based on the predetermined overhead rate. So we have $7.60, right? And we're going to multiply it by the actual direct labor hours, which is 15. So I got 114. Is that correct? Oh, we got confirmation. Thank you. So you add those three up. Notice again, we have actual direct material costs. We have actual direct labor costs. But we have to apply. So this is an estimate, isn't it? The predetermined overhead rate, when we apply it, it's based on estimates. Both these numbers were estimates. So we're estimating about how much that overhead's going into that job, because we need that information when we're going to bill out our customer. So I got 514, correct? Okay. Any questions regarding that? Part C, if land uses a markup percentage of 200% of its total manufacturing costs, what selling price for job 550? So 514 is the cost. We're going to mark it up 200%. What's the markup then?
28.
1,028. Is that what we're going to sell it at?
Nope, you have to add
No.
514.
No, it's not. Vanessa, what's the
You have
cost?
to add it to the 514, so it's 1,542.
Very good. Very good. So did you get $1,542?
Yep.
Is what we would charge a customer. Any questions there? So let's see what they have. How come they have a different number? Oh, this is machine hours versus ours is direct labor hour. Oh, that's why I'm not looking at the right solution. So is everybody in agreement here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then in part 2, they're saying a better allocation is that machine hours might be a better allocation. So we have to do it again, right? Using machine hours. So did this change the estimated fixed manufacturing overhead and variable? No, that stayed the
No.
same. That stayed the same. And did our allocation base? Oh, that changed, didn't it? The allocation base is not 140,000 direct labor hours. Instead, it is 70,000 machine hours. So what's going to be the predetermined overhead rate now?
I got 1520. It's the 1,064,000 divided by 70,000.
Okay, did everybody get that?
$15.20.
$15.20 is correct. Very good, Justin. So then when we calculate the total manufacturing cost, we're going to have the same for direct materials, the same for direct labor. What changes is how much we're applying. So we're going to apply $15.20 for every machine hour that it took. And there was 5 machine hours, correct? So
Correct.
5 times $15.20, that would give you,
That's 76.
that gives you 76. Okay. So $76 of overhead applied to job 550 along with the actual direct materials of 175 and the actual direct labor costs of 225. Would that give you $476 then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Any questions so far? So here's their solution. Okay, does everybody see that? Any questions on that?
No. Move it over a little.
Which
There you go.
way?
Nope, you're perfect
I
right
have a
now.
question.
Which question?
I noticed that on the sample that you had that like the double underline, like I didn't see them and they weren't present in the book as well.
What
Like
was
if we're if we're doing our homework, do we still have to double underline?
Oh, I double underline because
The totals.
well, that's the answer, right? It makes it easier. So if you have a bunch of numbers down and then it takes me a long time to look over everything, but if your final answer, so if you're answering the question, compute the total manufacturing overhead cost for a job 550, and I see a double underline, I'm gonna, oh, that's right, that's right. Do I need to look at every step in solving for it? It makes it easier for me. When you don't do it, it takes a long time for me to grade. And with 6 full classes, and then I got 1 class with just 1 student, it's tough. Electronically, it's really a nightmare. Some people scan their work in sideways, upside down. All of that takes extra time. And I
I
usually,
highlighted my answers.
oh, that's good. That's good.
So I was trying to help.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. So, all right, everybody's good there. Did we answer everything for part 2? Oh, no, they ask in C, if the markup is 200% of the total manufacturing cost, what's the selling price going to be now? So we would take 476. There's a couple of ways you could do it, right? 476 times,
2.
well, if you multiply it 2, that
The
gives you
percent.
952, and then you got to add the 476. So the
Right.
selling price of 1428. Yep, that's
Yep.
what they got too. Okay, so then part 3, assume that Layden's controller is right about machine hours being more accurate overhead cost allocation based than the direct labor hours. If the company continues to use direct labor hours as its only overhead cost allocation base, what implications does this have for pricing jobs such as job 550?
It'll be higher, so therefore they'll lose on the bids that against other companies.
That's a very good point. So companies that are looking for, what kind of a price it would take for you to get the job done. And if yours constantly comes in higher than your competitors, probably you're going to lose a lot of business, right? Unless you can distinguish your company when you guys do it, you do it right, and they never have a problem with the product they're receiving. So then maybe they would do that. But if everything else is equal, they generally people tend to buy where it costs them less money, right? So
Yep.
you're exactly right.
When I worked for a blind company, that was one of the things. I've worked for a couple different ones, and one of the companies that I worked for, he would actually finagle his prices just so that he could come in as a lower bid, but then was able to bump them and upgrade what they wanted to increase the price.
Ah, so that was one strategy, huh?
Yep.
Is that ethically a good way to conduct business?
No,
Some people would say, no, that's not a good way to conduct business. But he got business. But
yeah,
then,
he did.
but I mean, if you get the business and you just say, all right, this is what you're getting. I just want to make sure this is what we use for what you want. But if you want something that will last longer or a higher quality, better product, well, they're making the decision, right? For their needs, the lower expensive materials or whatever, maybe it's in the cost of direct materials, then they don't need it. They could stick with that lower bid. So then they would win, the customer, wouldn't they, in that case?
Yep.
But if they were looking for a better product and they needed it, the quality of the material to be higher or whatever, then they're paying more maybe because they didn't specifically ask for these specifications. So that's the one thing. You better know exactly what you want before you get bids because you'll be getting different bids based on different assumptions.
Yep.
All right, very good. But that is used by different companies to get business, and then they try to upsell it. I know I had a guy that was going to go ahead and do the HVAC work for me, and he suggested you might want different zones in your house so you can control the temperatures in those different zones separately. And there's an extra cost for that. And he says, I'm not trying to upsell you on this. I'm just telling you, have you considered, zoning? So I have part of my house that's not being used a lot. Well, I can keep that temperature at a lower amount during the summer, so I don't have to put on the air conditioning, run the air conditioning as much, and the opposite in the winter. So, I thought that was, that was something that made sense for me. And I did go ahead and zone the house for 3 different areas.
Nice.
Yeah, but I mean, it cost me more, but it wasn't after he explained it to me. And if I got other people coming in with bids to do HVAC work, maybe they wouldn't even mention that to me,
Right.
And so then for my needs, I didn't even know about. I didn't even consider something like that. I didn't know you can do something like that. So you got to be educated, and sometimes they're educating you, and you may or may not need it. I did. I wanted that, so that wasn't a problem for me. All
In the
right.
long run, you'll make up the difference though,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
saving on energy. So
And
it'll pay itself off.
and the person that I did business with, he seemed like he's a very honest individual. And so when it came to that, I paused and I gave it some thought. And I started thinking that would be really beneficial for my situation. So I went ahead and did that. All right. Any further discussion on problem 216 before we go on to the next one? Or no, are we done with that one? Or is there more to it? No, we're done, aren't we? We're done with 216. So now we go to 219. I think it's similar, but I think there's different questions asked.
There's 2 different
So
areas.
before this edition, the author just put everything in one chapter. And I guess they just thought it was too much for people to comprehend. So to me, this chapter, because they break it down and they're just focusing on how to calculate your predetermined overhead rate, I think it's fairly straightforward. And I hope you are understanding that as well. So problem 219 on page 93. We have multiple predetermined overhead rates applying overhead. High Desert Pottery Works makes a variety of pottery products that it sells to retailers. The company uses job order costing system in which the departmental predetermined overhead rate are used to apply manufacturing overhead cost to jobs. The predetermined overhead rate in the molding department is based on machine hours, and the rate in the painting department is based on direct labor hours. At the beginning of the year, the company provided the following estimates. So direct labor hours for the molding department was 12,000. For the painting department, it's 60,000. Machine hours, 70,000 for molding, 8,000 for painting. The fixed manufacturing overhead costs, 497,000 for the molding, 615,000 for painting. The variable manufacturing overhead per machine hour is $1.50. That's the molding. And the variable manufacturing overhead per direct labor hour is $2 for the painting department. Job 205 was started on August the 1st and completed on August the 10th. The company's cost records show the following information concerning the job. So they show the direct labor hours for both departments. They show machine hours. They show direct material costs, direct labor costs for both departments. Compute the predetermined overhead rate using the molding department and the painting department. So first off, we have to determine, okay, I read it, but I don't recall. For the molding, it's based on machine hours. Am I right there? And for the painting, they're basing the application of overhead based on direct labor hours. Okay. So what is the estimated overhead for each department? For start with for molding, what do we have? We have 2 parts of manufacturing overhead. We have the fixed manufacturing overhead, do we not?
Yeah.
497,000. And how about for painting? What is the fixed amount?
602.
650.
615,000. So molding, we're using machine hours, right? The variable overhead per machine hour is $1.50. So our variable manufacturing overhead, we're going to take $1.50 and we're going to multiply that by what?
70 machine hours,
How many hours?
70,000.
70,000. I didn't hear 70,000. I heard something else. So is that 105,000?
Yes.
Okay. But now
Add
for,
those two together.
yeah, that would give you the total estimated overhead, right?
Mhm.
It's not an actual amount. 497. So do you get 602,000?
Yep.
Yes.
That's for our
Molding.
the total estimated
Manufacturing overhead costs.
Yeah. And we're going to divide that by the allocation based on machine hours, correct? And what do they estimate the machine hours to be? We had to take the $1.50, right? And times X would be the number of hours, and that would give us the 105,000, correct? So it's 70,000 machine hours, right?
$8.60.
So that gives you $8.60.
Per machine hour.
Very good. You've identified it correctly. So now over here, the painting, the variable based on direct labor hours, right? So $2, and we're going to use
60.
Yeah, so we're going to use 60,000, and that's direct labor hours. So would that give us 120,000?
Correct.
And then that's 5, 3, and 7, 735,000 divided by our 60,000 direct labor hours.
$12.25.
So this is direct labor hours. We get $12. And how many cents?
25.
And that's per direct labor hour. Okay. So that's how we're going to apply the overhead in each department. Everybody good on that? So we computed the predetermined overhead rate for both. Compute the total overhead for job 205. So in the molding department, they were doing that based on machine hours, correct?
Yep.
So to figure
It was
out,
110.
yeah, we got to multiply 110 machine hours to do that job times $8.60 is our predetermined overhead rate. So how much does that give us?
946.
So that's our applied overhead, applied manufacturing overhead to the job. And do we have direct material cost at actual? $770. Am I reading that correctly? And then the actual direct, I don't know if you can see that or
Labor.
not. How much is the direct labor?
525.
525. So we have the three costs. We have direct materials and direct labor at actual, and the manufacturing overhead is at an applied rate. So the total would be,
20
what is it?
2,241.
And that's for molding.
Yep.
Painting, we'll just start right off the bat. Direct materials, I always like to start with direct material cost, 1,000.
332.
Yes, and direct labor.
1,470.
Okay, so now the manufacturing overhead, and that's going to be applied based at $12.25. And the direct labor hours for that job is what?
30.
Is it 84?
Oh,
Directly.
84, yeah.
Yeah, I heard something different than 84, so I better check that, I thought. 1225 times 84. I get 1,029, right?
Yeah.
So is that $3,031 for the painting department?
3,831.
Yeah, that's what I got. Maybe I didn't say that. Okay, so
Quick question.
yeah, go ahead.
So for number 2, so it says compute the total overhead cost applied to job 205. Wouldn't the number actually end up coming out to 1,975 because we're just taking those 2 overhead applications and combining them? Because the ones where we get the 3,831, that would be the total manufacturing cost for that department rather than the overhead applied. Is that correct?
Well, yes, you would be correct because what we did, we computed the total overhead cost for each department and then we determined what the overall cost. So we didn't answer their question in part 2, right? Their question is compute total overhead cost applied. So we applied right there 946.
That's $1,029.
So when we add those together, we should be answering their question now, right?
Yeah.
1,975.
I just want to make sure I was following right and it wasn't a misunderstanding on my part. So no, it looks like I'm getting all the same numbers. Like I said, I just wanted to.
No, you were right. The last problem we had kind of had us do this, didn't they? And that's what I was just kind of working through it. But if definitely after you think you got the answer, reread the question. And you're absolutely right. Compute the total overhead costs applied to job 205. So you had to add what was applied for out of the molding and out of the painting. So that's the correct answer. Thank you. And then part 3, what would be the total manufacturing cost recorded for job 205 if the job contained 50 units? So they want to know the total manufacturing costs recorded for job 205. That's one question in part 3. You got to answer both parts. If the job contained 50 units, what would be the unit product cost? So if they want to know the total manufacturing cost, it would be these two numbers added together, correct? Because we have 3 manufacturing costs in molding. We have the amount for manufacturing overhead applied, the actual amount for direct materials, direct labor, and we have the same thing for the painting. So the total would be these two added together. So what do you have when you add that together?
6,072.
6,072? That's what I got.
70. Wow.
You got 70 what? So 1 and 1.
Oh, I wrote the wrong number.
See, those things happen all the time. So there's part 3, first question. So let's read the question one more time and make sure we answered it. What would be the total manufacturing cost for job 205? Yes, we just simply took the manufacturing cost for both departments, and that would be the first question in part 3. Then if the job contained 50 units, could we find the cost per unit then by dividing 50 into the total costs? Seems like that's what you would do. And is that what you did?
Yeah.
And did you get $121.44?
Yeah.
Okay, that wasn't so bad, was it?
Mm-mm.
But a good lesson for all of us. Make sure we're answering the question that's being asked, because we all kind of make assumptions. as we're going through sometimes. So it's always good at the end to double check you've answered the correct question. And that happens in multiple choice answers. There's answers there that are correct, but you got to go back to what are they asking? What question are they asking to make sure you answer correctly? All right, anything else in our two problems that we had or anything else in chapter 2?
Just for the P216, the requirement 3. I just reiterated what they had in the textbook.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question again.
It wasn't a question. I was just adding to what was already said for
Okay.
requirement 3 of P216.
Oh, for problem 16?
Yeah, I just wrote that the selling price for job 550 using the predetermined overhead rate with direct labor hours as the allocation base is higher than the predetermined overhead rate with machine hours as the allocation base. And the textbook says when it applies more overhead to production than it actually incurs, it results in over-applied overhead. So an adjustment for over-applied overhead decreases cost of goods sold and increases net operating income.
That's correct. So at the end of the accounting period, we will make an adjustment to get the applied amount to be what actual is. And so if during the time period they had over applied the overhead, then that's an adjusting journal entry we have to make. We would have to reduce the cost of goods sold. There's two ways to make the adjustment. You could take it all to cost of goods sold, which is the simpler way. And so if we over applied it, we would have to debit the manufacturing overhead account and credit the cost of goods sold account. And we'll get into that in chapter 3. But you're absolutely right there, Greg. Any other questions or comments on chapter 2 before we get into chapter 3?
I'm actually still confused on problem 19 for the final question, number 3. Why did we have to combine both the labor and direct hours if they were being calculated separate the whole time prior?
Well, what we were doing is for one department, the molding department, the better way to apply the overhead was to use machine hours. So we use machine hours to determine the application rate, right?
Mhm.
And how much we're going to apply. But for the painting department, they tell us that we're going to use direct labor hours as a better correlation as our allocation base for overhead.
So do you basically take the numbers that are gonna cost the most? Because you'll spend more time painting than you will like
Well,
whipping up the paint. Is that kind of?
well, whatever, whatever they decide is the better way to apply it. It's better to apply overhead based on direct labor hours. And you probably are right, Vanessa, because it's the time the direct laborers take to get the paint on the product would be better at a correlation of overhead for that department. But for the molding is
Hands-on.
probably heavily machine operated department, right? And so
Right.
those overhead costs probably are more toward machinery, right? Whereas the painting would be more direct labor. So that's we have two different allocation bases. So, and that happens in the real world where different departments have a different application rate. The application rate will be the one that best suited for that department. So you don't have to worry about it in the problems. You just follow what the problem states. But when you get out in the real world, then if you're the manager, you'll have to talk to your employees and ask them, what goes on in that department, and you'll determine then which would be better for that department, how the overhead's going to be applied. All
Okay.
right.
That makes sense.
So do you like managerial accounting where you're determining things, you're going to be a manager? So this really applies more to all business majors, because they'll be in the future, somebody's going to take a job with the factory operation, and they might be in the plant and they become the general manager of that plant. And then you're going to say, oh, okay, I remember we had different ways to allocate overhead. It's like, how do we attach cost to these different products? What's the best way? What's the fairest, the best way for our production? So some of that's going to be subjective, isn't it? And then you might calculate it 2 or 3 different ways and look at costs.
You just have to make sure you stay out of the red.
Yeah, the whole purpose of being in business is to make a profit. And why? Is because capitalistic society is really evil? Or if you give an incentive to manufacture and make a profit, people are going to compete to get the job done the most efficient way to make a profit, right? If you can produce it faster or better quality, you're going to have an edge in the competitive world that we live in. When I was in the Soviet Union, they just had one company that manufactured pens. They weren't worried about profit. And when I was over there, I bought one of those pens. It lasted about a week. They don't have an incentive to make it to be the best pen ever made, because there's no profit. There's no incentive to do that. It's
amazing how much pens can cost.
Oh yeah. I had a student that collected pens, and he showed me some of his collection, pretty exotic pens from around the world. So
nice.
Yeah. So everybody has different interests. That's what makes us human beings interesting. So it was interesting to me. I didn't even know such a thing occurred. And he told me some of the details. It was kind of quite interesting. All right, now let's get on to the new material, because that's always a little bit harder first time you see something. So chapter 3, this is when we get into the meat of job order costing. So it's a system used when you have many different products being produced, and they're different and unique from one another. So that's when job order costing. So if you're building custom homes, you would want to use job order costing. You would want to know what's the actual direct labor cost to build that house. You would want to know the actual materials, the direct materials, and then it's the overhead that you're going to have to allocate for the third component. Absorption costing is a method in which we include all manufacturing costs. There are only 3 manufacturing costs: direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. We break manufacturing overhead down into 2 components, the variable and the fixed. So it hasn't changed. It's always been 3 costs, but now we're breaking it down into the variable and fixed portion. As we learned in chapter 1, fixed cost is fixed in total, but on a per unit basis, the more units you produce, the cost per unit for that fixed cost decreases. A variable cost increases in total as you produce more units, but on a per unit basis, that variable cost remains the same. All right, predetermined overhead rate, the rate used to charge manufacturing overhead cost to jobs, that's established in advance each period. So it's based on estimates It's estimated total manufacturing overhead cost divided by whatever the estimated basis determined to be. Over application. This is something you got to get a grasp on because some people get this mixed up and confused. Overhead application, the process of assigning overhead cost to specific jobs. You take the predetermined overhead rate and multiply it by the actual allocation base for that job. Normal costing, it's a costing system in which overhead costs are applied to a job by multiplying a predetermined overhead rate by actual amount of allocation base incurred. And job cost sheet, that's the number one document that we use to determine the overall cost to produce that product. So it's a record that keeps track of direct materials going into that job, direct labor costs going into that job. Those are easy. Direct materials, when you requisition raw materials that are considered direct materials onto a particular job you're working, that is easily accounted for. The direct labor, they have to keep track of their time working on that project, and you just multiply the direct labor hours times their labor rate to get the actual cost. But it's the manufacturing overhead that has to be estimated, but we don't use that term. We apply the manufacturing overhead to the job. So some raw materials taken out of the raw materials inventory warehouse is going to be indirect. So the indirect materials, indirect labor, we're going to debit another account. So the work in process account will be debited for our direct materials, the actual direct material costs, and the actual direct labor costs. But the manufacturing overhead that gets debited in a work in process account is going to be the applied amount. So that's something that I need to emphasize, and hopefully you get it, because under exam conditions, students kind of forget. So when you first acquire materials, raw materials inventory. So that is going to include both direct materials and indirect materials that they're buying, right? What gets debited to the work in process inventory, that's where you take the raw materials out of the raw materials inventory warehouse and you put it on the factory floor. So you're going to put actual direct material costs will be debited to the work in process inventory, and you're going to credit raw materials inventory, but that's only for the direct materials. You're going to have another account called manufacturing overhead. This is a temporary account. This account has to be closed out at the end of the accounting period, like all other temporary accounts. The left side, I can't emphasize this enough. The left side, you'll debit manufacturing overhead for actual. All right. So we take some indirect materials out of raw materials inventory. We have to debit manufacturing overhead for indirect materials. The direct materials goes into work in process. We have indirect labor costs. That'd be like the supervisor, general manager, maintenance people. We're going to debit manufacturing overhead. What would we credit? Well, if we didn't pay our employees yet, it'd be salaries and wages payable, right? But the direct labor actual gets debited to work in process. What was your question, Vanessa?
What's IL stand for? Indirect labor.
Indirect labor. IM, indirect material. So we're debiting this temporary account. It's called also a clearing account. The left side is recording all actual costs. The other side is the applied amount. When we apply manufacturing overhead to a job, we debit manufacturing overhead to work in process. It's going to be applied. And you credit manufacturing overhead. You see that? You debit what you're applying to the job. The job's being worked on the floor of the factory. We keep track of actual direct material costs going into that job. We keep track of actual direct labor costs going into that job, but we're applying the manufacturing overhead to that job. We debit work in process and we credit manufacturing overhead. The difference, and then you'll have other items. You can have like utilities on the factory building. So factory utility cost, right? Electricity, etc. That's going to be debited in manufacturing overhead. We're not going to expense that off in this time period because it has to do with the factory operation. The utility cost to operate the executive building, that's going to be expensed off. We're going to debit utilities expense. But if it has to do with the factory and it's not direct materials or direct labor, then it's manufacturing overhead. And you're going to debit the account manufacturing overhead. The only time you credit the manufacturing overhead account is for the amount that you applied to jobs. At the end of the accounting period, you'll add both sides up, and let's just make it a simple situation. We had $1,005 was the actual, and the credit side was 1,000. So question number one, if this is a clearing account or temporary account, we got to zero this account out. How do we clear this account out or get it to zero? What would we need to do? What would the adjusting entry include?
Be $5
So where?
to debit the.
So you want to
Temporary
debit?
account.
You want to debit 5 here?
Oh, no. Sorry. Applied. On the applied side.
Oh, the credit. You're going to credit
Credit,
manufacturing overhead. Now, our debits equal our credits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this account now would be closed. It would be
Yeah.
zeroed out, right? But that's one. So the journal entry, you got to debit something, you're going to credit manufacturing overhead. What would be debited? Greg said it. Greg, what did you say when we were talking about chapter 2? Greg, are you there with us still?
I'm sorry, I had it muted.
You mentioned we had to adjust something
Yeah,
in chapter 2. What was it that you were talking about when we have to adjust something?
I was talking about P216.3. It said an adjustment for over-applied overhead decreases cost of goods sold and increases net operating income.
You did
Cost of
say
goods
that.
sold.
You did say that. But in this case here, right here, Greg, look at the screen. If we had debit of $1,005 and we had a credit of 1,000, did we over or under apply the overhead?
Looks like it's
What's that?
over-applied,
No,
under-applied.
this is what we applied. We applied $5 too little. So we under applied. Actual is $1,005, right?
Okay. Yeah.
If we had to applied $1,100, now we over applied. The actual was $1,005. We're $95 over the actual. So that's when it's over applied. So it's to me, it makes sense. Always ask the question, what did we apply? First time we had $1,000. What was actual? 105. We didn't apply enough. We under applied by 5. So the adjustment would be we have to increase our cost of goods sold and reduce our manufacturing overhead by crediting it. So now that zeroes this account out. We accomplished closing the account and we adjusted the cost of goods sold. You see that, Greg? That's the simpler way of when you have in the first case when we applied 1,000 and actual was $1,005, we under applied. In the second case where we said what we applied was 1,100 and actual is 1,005, we applied $95 more than what the actual was. So then we would have to debit the account to get to zero now. And so what would happen in the adjusting entry? We would have to debit manufacturing overhead 95, and we'd have to reduce cost of goods sold 95
Credit.
because we had applied $1,100 when the actual manufacturing overhead was only 1,005. So we applied too much. And when the goods are completed and sold, that's when you expense it off in the account called cost of goods sold. So our cost of goods sold would, since they over applied it with 1,100, would be too high. So we got to reduce that expense account by $95. You got it, Greg? You
Yeah.
might not have it, but when you read the chapter, hopefully it'll all come together.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so on page 114, they show these three accounts. Well, they show salaries and wages payable. Notice they credit that 75,000 because they haven't paid their employees. Some of the workers were working in the factory, and that would belong the direct laborers get debited to work in process, doesn't it? So let's see if we can put this up here on the camera can get it. There you go. So of the 75,000, only 60,000 was direct labor. All right. This was the beginning balance. So some of the products weren't finished last time period, carried over this time period. Number 2 is manufacturing overhead. Is that right? $50,000, or is that direct material cost? That must be direct material cost, right? They don't identify it. Maybe up in here, probably up in here they do. Yeah. So turn back to page 113. Here it is here. They debited work in process 50,000, manufacturing overhead 2,000. So this is materials. So they had issue of direct and indirect material during April. Materials requisition forms, that means they're just asking, hey, we need these materials into production. We're prepared, authorized withdrawal of 52,000 in raw materials from the storeroom. The raw materials included 50,000 of direct materials, 2,000 of indirect materials. So notice the direct materials gets debited to work in process, but the indirect materials get debited to manufacturing overhead. And then they credit the raw materials inventory, 52,000. And on the previous page, they show they acquired 60,000 of raw materials on account. So they credited accounts payable. They didn't pay cash. And of the 60,000, they put 52,000 into production, 50,000 being direct, 2,000 being indirect. And they're taking it out of raw materials. So the materials flow from raw materials into the factory floor. That's work in process. Once it gets completed, it gets transferred to finished goods inventory. And then when it gets sold, that's when we expense it off. So here's some manufacturing overhead costs. Utilities to heat water and power, the factory building, the rental on the factory equipment, miscellaneous factory overhead costs. So there's 40,000. So they debited manufacturing. Remember I said you debit manufacturing overhead for actual manufacturing costs. They didn't pay for these, so they owe their suppliers that. And then 13,000 in accrued property taxes, and that's 7,000 in the prepaid insurance on the factory building. So there's some additional overhead items. 13,000 represents property tax on the factory building, and then another 7,000 insurance on the factory. A credited property taxes payable for 13,000, prepaid insurance for 7. And then they had depreciation on the factory equipment. So you see the credits could be all different. Here we used accounts payable. Here we use property taxes payable. That's a liability. Prepaid insurance, we paid it before the time period started. We started to work on it. By the end of the time period, we used up $7,000 of that asset that related to the factory operation. If we had other prepaid insurance that was for the executive offices, well, guess what? We would debit insurance expense credit prepaid insurance. So the debits are different, aren't they? And then they talk about applying manufacturing overhead. When you apply, you debit work in process, as I mentioned, it goes in at the applied amount, and you credit manufacturing overhead. So you're going to have to do journal entries on exam 1. So you have to know which journal entries, you got to know which accounts are being debited and credited for job order costing. We use the exact same accounts for process costing, which is chapter 4. It's just that process costing, we have multiple departments to complete those goods. And then non-manufacturing costs, those are selling administrative costs. They're known as period costs. And you can read about those. Those are costs we already had done in accounting 255. And then they use the T accounts to summarize all those. So this is a good page because it brings it all together. This is how your answer sheet's going to be on the exam. I'm going to give you transactions, and you got to journalize them. And then all they did was they, on the next page, show posting to the general ledger. So since we're running out of time, I want you to really understand this schedule of cost of goods manufactured on page 121, because you're going to be tested on preparing a schedule of cost of goods manufacturing. Just very quickly, a schedule of cost of goods manufactured, guess what it includes? Direct material cost, direct labor cost, and manufacturing overhead. The first two are at actual. The manufacturing overhead is at the applied amount. And then you got to add the beginning work in process, and you got to subtract out the ending work in process. So there's 5 things you got to remember. The 3 manufacturing costs, the first 2 are at actual costs. The manufacturing's overheads at the applied, and then you got to add the beginning work in process, or I refer to it as WIP for short, WIP, and you subtract out the ending WIP. So I say you got to remember the 3 manufacturing costs, and you got to whip it. You got to whip it good, just like that old song. And so on page 121, they give an example how to prepare one. And then they talk about computing under and over applied overhead. We kind of already touched on that. So that should be easy. And then to close out the cost of goods sold account. We kind of did that already, didn't we? But then the closing the under or over applied overhead using work in process account, finished goods, and cost of goods sold. So that's the harder way. You got to proportionally work that out. So you're going to have to read on that because time is expired. Okay, class. So you got your notes on that chapter 3. I think it should be somewhat easy, but that's because I've been doing it for 40 years. you guys, it's your first time. It'll take you some time. That's just how it is. And then you have some homework problems on that chapter. All right. So I don't know if I'll be live or if I have to do a video something because of the snow. I was informed today we're going to get feet instead of just inches of snow. So who knows? It's going to start snowing tomorrow. It's going to keep going until I think Tuesday, right? Isn't that what you told me, Justin?
It's gonna be. I think we're gonna get a break on Tuesday, Wednesday, then it's gonna come back again. So
Yeah. So it just depends if it's too much snow because I live, probably out there by Snowball. If there's too much snow out there, I might not be able to get in. I don't have internet access where I'm at currently. So I might have to prepare a recording. But I pretty much covered the chapter. So I probably would just go over some examples on that. And the only part I didn't go over in detail was that when you have to allocate the under or over applied overhead to the 3 accounts, work in process, because work in process, that's the first place that we debit manufacturing overhead into work in process. And then when you're done building the product, it gets transferred to finished goods. So you could have some of that under or over applied overhead in finished goods as well as work in process, and then some to the cost of goods sold. So when you read that page, you should be able to see, and I'll try to put together a recording on allocating the overhead, under or over applied overhead to those 3 accounts. All right. Any questions? All right.
Yeah, we don't have a quiz this week, right?
I don't know. I haven't looked at. I set up your homework for, I don't know, 4 or 5 chapters. I did that for 6 classes, and I can't remember what everything.
There's
Yeah,
no
the
quiz
quiz
this,
is-
there's no
quiz is
quiz
next
this
week.
weekend.
So there's no, yeah, the quiz is on 2 and 3, right? Because those 2 chapters are on job order costing. All right. Well, you guys have a great weekend. Stay up on it. You guys, for the most part, are doing excellent. So everybody keeps working hard like they are. You're going to make it through. It's when people start falling behind, they quit doing their assignments or they're turning them in late, and I usually give them 50% is all for being late. So don't be late. In the real world, if you're late, you suffer big consequences. If by one day, by 1 hour, 1 minute past midnight, you file your tax return, you're late, and you get hit with a 5% penalty if you under applied, if you didn't put in enough taxes. So, all right, people, just do the best you can.